The bench by the sea. The wind that day wasn't violent or loud, but soft, steady, and cold. The kind of breeze that whispered through jacket collars and made even the strongest pause, if only to remember. Keanu Reeves stood there, silent, hands in the pockets of his dark coat, staring at the waves as they curled and receded, again and again, like time itself rewinding and pushing forward without permission. His hair had grown longer than usual, a quiet rebellion against the passing months, maybe even years, and his eyes, those same deep, worn eyes that had once stared across red carpets, were now watching something much older, much quieter than any crowd. He wasn't here for the sea. He was here for the place, the bench. The bench where they once sat, not as stars, not as performers, not as names, but as two people who had discovered something rare, something terrifying, something real. Years ago, in the middle of noise, premieres, scripts, and expectations, they had found a pause here. He remembered that day not by the clothes they wore or the way the clouds looked, but by the way Sandra laughed, the way she leaned back with her arms spread wide and said, "Maybe we're the only real thing in this town." He hadn't known what to say back then, so he stayed silent, and yet somehow she understood. There had been no script between them, no direction, no spotlight, just two people on a bench, watching the sea, talking about life like they had all the time in the world. But then time moved, as it always does, and people drifted. Even people who were supposed to stay, they never fought. That was the strange part. There was no explosive goodbye, no betrayal, just life, pulling them apart with gentle, relentless fingers. She took one project, he took another. The silence between them grew, not angry, just unspoken. There were messages left unsent, calls not made, and then one day it had been 3 years. 3 years since he had last seen her eyes in person. 3 years since she laughed on that bench, calling him too serious for someone so soft. He had smiled at that, quietly, the way he always did with her. Now, standing here again, older, emptier, and with far fewer illusions, Keanu wasn't even sure why he came. Maybe he had hoped the place could speak for him, that if he sat again it would summon the past and whisper her name into the wind. But she was already there. He saw her before she saw him. Or maybe she saw him and pretended not to. She was sitting on the very same bench, a thick scarf wrapped around her neck, her sunglasses tucked into the collar of her sweater. Her hair danced in the breeze just like it did in his memories, and her posture. It was the same, relaxed but alert, tired but open. She hadn't changed. No, that wasn't true. She had changed, but not in a way the world would notice. Only someone who had once memorized her like poetry would know. He stopped walking. A few feet away now, frozen. "Sandra," he said, not to call her but because he needed to believe it was her. Not a mirage, not a ghost, not regret playing tricks on his senses. She turned slowly. Her eyes met his, and something fell between them. Not a tear, not a smile, not a word. Just a weight that only two people who had once almost loved each other could recognize. She didn't stand. He didn't move closer. For a full minute they just existed, breathing the same wind, staring, remembering. Then she said softly, "You came." He nodded. "I didn't know why. Until now." Her lips twitched, almost a smile, but there was pain there. Not the sharp kind, the old kind. The kind that had sat quietly in both of them for too long. She looked at the spot beside her on the bench, then back at him. "Still your seat, if you want it." Keanu moved slowly, as if the moment might disappear if he stepped too fast. He sat beside her, leaving just enough space to honor the years that had passed. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. It was what they had always done best. Sitting in quiet that meant everything. "You still don't talk much," she said after a while, glancing sideways. "And you still pretend you don't miss the silence," he replied. She chuckled. It was the first time in years he had heard her laugh that wasn't through a screen or filtered through some interview. And God, he had missed it more than he ever admitted. "I was scared you wouldn't come," she said suddenly. I almost turned back. I almost didn't. So, why did you? Keanu looked out at the sea. The waves rolled forward, patient and unstoppable. Because I realized, he said slowly, that all the years I spent away didn't make me forget. They just made me quieter about it. Sandra blinked. The wind blew a strand of hair across her cheek, but she didn't move to brush it away. And what exactly were you quiet about? He turned to her now. Really turned. You. A pause. Then another. And what about me? She whispered. He exhaled like a man lifting a burden he had carried through storms. That I loved you once. That I never told you. And that somehow, I think I still do. The sea kept moving, but time did not. Sandra's throat tightened. Her hand, resting on her lap, curled slightly. She didn't look at him. Instead, she looked at the horizon. But when she spoke, her voice was firm, gentle but without hesitation. I waited here last year, she said. Same day, same bench. I waited for you, Keanu, for hours. He felt something shift inside him. I thought maybe the universe would be kind, that maybe you'd remember, or feel it, but I went home alone. He swallowed. I didn't know. I know, she said. And that's why I'm still here now. He looked at her, trying to read what she meant. She finally turned to him, her eyes clearer than the sky above them. I'm here. Keanu, I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm not asking for promises. But if you're here, really here, then maybe this time, we don't walk away. He stared at her for a long, trembling second. Then he nodded, just once. And in that one motion, something inside him, something that had stayed hidden beneath years of silence, success, grief, and loneliness, broke open. Not painfully, beautifully. As the sun began to dip low, painting the waves in gold, Keanu reached out slowly and took her hand. She didn't pull away, and for the first time in years, they sat not in memory, but in beginning. The conversation. They never had. They didn't let go of each other's hands. Not when the wind turned colder. Not when the tide crept closer to the rocks. Not even when the sun vanished behind a curtain of gold and the world started to fade into gray. They sat like that, silent, grounded. Two people who had lived lifetimes between meetings. Two people who had finally stopped running from the one truth neither of them had ever fully spoken. But the silence was not heavy. It was sacred. It was the kind of silence that only belonged to those who had once lost something important, and now, by some strange miracle, had been given another chance to name it, hold it, understand it. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost cautious, but it didn't waver. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't drifted? Her eyes weren't looking at him, not directly. They were watching the way the ocean swallowed the horizon. Her words hung between them like smoke that didn't disappear, only lingered. And Keanu, still holding her hand, didn't answer right away. He didn't need to rush. The moment asked for honesty, not speed. He breathed in the salt, the air, the history that still clung to this place, and said quietly, "Every day, I think about the version of my life where I chose differently, where I stayed still, where I stopped pretending I was okay with letting you go." Sandra blinked, once. No tears came, but the emotion was alive behind her eyes, breathing with every word he spoke. "I waited, you know," she said. "I gave interviews, I smiled, I took new roles. But there were always days, like birthdays or quiet mornings when the house felt too big, when I hoped you'd call, even just to say hi, but the phone never rang." Keanu looked down at their hands, still clasped. His thumb gently moved against hers, barely, as if testing if it was real. "I thought I'd missed the window," he admitted. "Thought maybe I was too late, that I'd taken too long to grow up, to admit I was scared, not of you, but of how much you made me feel." There was something disarming in how simply he said it, as if he'd carried that sentence for years, waiting for the air to be right. Sandra turned her head slowly to him. "And what do you feel now?" she asked, not accusing, not hopeful, just curious, raw, honest. He met her gaze, not flinching. I feel like time is offering me one last chance to stop pretending I don't love you." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They cracked something open in the space between them. Sandra inhaled sharply, like air had returned to her lungs for the first time in a long while. "It was always you," she whispered. "Even when I tried to forget, even when I dated others, even when I convinced myself it was just a phase, your silence still sounded louder than anyone's voice." Keanu looked down again. His voice was lower now, edged with quiet regret. "I used to think love meant knowing how to say the right thing. But with you, it was different. I didn't need to say anything. Just being near you felt like everything was already understood. And that scared me. Because if you ever left, I didn't know who I'd be." Sandra nodded. "You left before I could. The line wasn't cruel. It was just true, and it hit both of them with the kind of clarity that only comes when years have already passed, and the blame is too heavy to place on just one pair of shoulders." Keanu closed his eyes, his grip tightening slightly. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not just for leaving, but for not being strong enough to stay." A wave crashed harder against the shore, and for a moment the sound of nature filled the silence between confessions. When it faded, Sandra stood. She looked down at him. Not from above, not in judgment, but as someone who had waited years to see if this man would ever stop hiding from himself. "Walk with me," she said, reaching out her free hand. They left the bench behind, stepping slowly along the path that curved alongside the beach. The gravel crunched beneath their feet, the stars slowly piercing through the sky above, like old memories trying to find their way home. "Do you still keep that motorcycle?" Sandra asked after a while. He smiled faintly. "Still in the garage, still leaks oil, still makes me feel like I'm 20. You once told me you wanted to ride it through Europe," she said. "Said you'd stop in random towns and write poems no one would ever read." Keanu laughed, and the sound was warm, almost boyish. "I think I still might. But only if someone's riding with me this time." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was her answer. They walked until the path turned into stairs, and at the top was a small inn with yellow windows glowing softly into the night. "I'm staying here," Sandra said. "Just for the weekend. Didn't know if I'd have the courage to sit on that bench again. But I had to try." Keanu looked up at the place. "And now?" "I think I'm ready," she said. "To talk, to not pretend. To ask you questions I've buried for too long." He hesitated only briefly before asking. "Like what?" She paused at the top step, turning back to face him fully. "Like why you never came to the hospital?" That question stopped him. His eyes dropped. "When your mother died," she added, her voice now shaking a little. "I waited. I thought you'd come. You were the only one who understood how much she meant to me." He looked up slowly, and the pain in his face wasn't performative. It was old, carved. "I found out 2 days later. I was filming overseas. No one told me until after the funeral. When I called, you didn't pick up. I was angry," she said. "Not just at you, at everything. At loss, at silence, at how people leave and never explain." "I should have tried harder," he said. Sandra didn't argue. "Yes, you should have." But then she added, "And I should have called you back." They stared at each other again. Not as wounded ex-lovers, but as survivors of a quiet war no one else saw. "I don't want to lose more years," Keanu said finally. "Not to fear, not to silence, not to pride." Sandra's voice was almost a whisper. "Then stay," he nodded. "I will." And that night they didn't talk about love, or the past, or the future. They simply shared tea in the quiet kitchen of the inn. 2 cups, 1 soft lamp, and the kind of peace that doesn't shout its return, but settles slowly, deeply, in the hearts of those who still dare to hope. The night they finally faced the truth, sleep didn't come easily that night, not because of pain or fear, but because for the first time in years both of them were afraid of missing 1 second of what was finally happening between them. Keanu lay awake staring at the ceiling of his small guest room inside that old inn, hearing the sea through the thin wooden walls like an old song that refused to fade. He replayed every moment on the bench, How she was already there before him. How she waited there last year. How she still loved him quietly through every season they grew apart. It shook him more than any movie role ever had. Because real life wasn't scripted. Real life had consequences. Real life had silence that could destroy love, not in one day, but slowly over years. Like rust. Sandra was in the room 2 doors down, and he wondered if she was awake too, wondering the same thing. What do 2 souls who separated and returned after years do with this second chance? But maybe the universe already answered by bringing them back here without plan, expectation, negotiation, or timing. Only life could write that kind of crossing. The next morning, they both went downstairs unexpectedly at the exact same time, as if something invisible pulled their feet into synchronicity again. Sandra had her hair tied up, no makeup, only a simple beige sweater, and she looked more human, more real, more breathtaking than any red carpet version of her ever did. Keanu wore a black hoodie and held 2 mugs of tea. When he saw her, he didn't say good morning. He just handed her the second mug like this was what they always did, as if their normal had always been this. Quiet, sincere, grounded. She smiled when she accepted it, because that was one of the things she always loved about him. He never tried to fill silence with pointless noise. He respected the space between words. "There's something we need to talk about," she said softly, not sitting yet, still standing in the early light that entered through the old inn windows like soft golden dust. His face didn't tense. He already knew. He nodded, and they sat at the table closest to the window. "Why did you disappear after we wrapped that last film together?" Sandra asked. Her tone wasn't accusing, only needing the kind of clarity that can only come from the actual person who walked away, not from imagination or assumptions that keep wounds alive. Keanu stared into the steam rising from his cup before answering. "Because that film made everything too real for me," he said slowly. "I wasn't acting near you anymore. Every scene felt like truth. Every moment between takes felt like possibility, and it terrified me because I finally realized if I fell for you completely, you would be the one thing I couldn't emotionally survive losing." He shook his head. "So I left first. I told myself distance would save me." Sandra listened, quiet, eyes steady, not interrupting. "But it didn't," he continued. "It only made it worse. I missed what could have been more than I had ever missed anything in my entire life." Sandra lowered her head into her hands for a moment, breathing deeply, the weight of those words unraveling years of pain that had been compacted inside her chest like stone. When she raised her face again, her voice trembled but held strength inside every syllable. "You weren't the only one scared, Keanu. I was afraid too. I was afraid that we were too fragile, too vulnerable, too unguarded with each other. I had success, fame, recognition, but you were the only thing that made me feel like a real person, and that was terrifying. Because when someone becomes the only real thing in your life, and you lose them, what are you left with?" She swallowed. "So maybe we both lost each other trying to avoid losing each other." That realization sat between them like emotional truth carved into stone. They had spent years protecting themselves from a heartbreak that never even needed to exist. They suffered in silence out of fear of imaginary loss, and in doing so they created real loss that didn't have to happen. Keanu reached across the table very slowly and placed his hand over hers again. This time she didn't look away, didn't hesitate, didn't protect herself with sarcasm or neutrality or professional distance. She let herself feel the moment just as it was. "Maybe this time we choose differently," he said quietly. "Maybe this time we stop letting fear write the ending before we even reach the middle." Sandra's lips parted with the slightest breath that felt like relief after years of emotional suffocation. He was right. They never ended because they never began properly. And now time had given them a doorway again. Not to rewrite the past, but to finally start the chapter they were too afraid to open before. They walked later that day again along the beach, but this time they walked closer, shoulders almost brushing. Steps aligned like muscle memory returning after years of silent storage. The sea didn't feel sad anymore. It felt like witness. They talked about old memories, but then slowly shifted to new wishes. new things they wanted to do in the future. Not promises in words, but intentions in tone. Sandra asked, "Do you think people only get one real soulmate in a lifetime?" Keanu answered after thinking for a long moment. "No. I think people get more than one chance, but they rarely get the same soul twice." They both knew exactly what he meant. The universe had returned them to each other, which meant they were part of the rare few. When they returned to the inn, Sandra stopped beside him before going inside. She placed her hand over his heart, not symbolically but gently, calmly, with a softness that felt like home. "This time," she whispered, "let's not run." Keanu closed his eyes and leaned slightly forward so his forehead touched hers for one slow, still second. "We won't," he answered. And as the evening sun dropped behind the horizon once more, neither of them felt fear anymore. They felt something they had not allowed themselves to feel in years: safety in each other again. The letter he never sent. The third day in that coastal town didn't begin like the others. The wind was heavier, and the sky above the inn had turned the color of pewter, hanging low with clouds that looked like they might break open at any moment. Keanu stood by the window of his room, watching the distant horizon as if it had something to confess. Something was stirring inside him, restless, unresolved. Last night had been peaceful, maybe even healing, but this morning brought a quiet ache he couldn't explain, as if time was whispering, now or never. The weight of all the years they had lost pressed against his chest, not just with Sandra, but with life itself. And deep within the drawer of his travel bag, hidden under a rolled black sweater, was something he hadn't dared touch in a long time. A letter he had written 2 years ago. One he never sent. One that had lived in silence the way his feelings had lived in silence. He opened the drawer with hesitant fingers and took it out. The envelope was unsealed, yellowing slightly at the corners like old secrets do. He sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the paper slowly, as if reading it again might hurt less this time. But it didn't. His eyes scanned the words he had poured out when the grief of her absence had been unbearable, but his pride still intact. It wasn't a love letter, not in the traditional sense. It was a letter full of confessions he hadn't spoken aloud. Regrets, dreams, moments that haunted him, like the way she used to put her hand on his chest before falling asleep, or how she once waited outside a film set for 2 hours just to give him soup because he looked pale on camera. He'd written about how he couldn't enjoy premieres without looking over his shoulder hoping she might appear. He wrote that her silence hurt more than criticism ever could. And in the last line, the one he still remembered word for word, he had written, "I don't know if I'll ever earn the right to tell you this, but if I see you again and you're still willing to look me in the eyes, I will find the courage to say everything I never did." The words shook him, not because they weren't true, but because they still were. Downstairs, Sandra was seated at the small dining area, a journal in her lap, half a piece of toast untouched on her plate. She was staring into her tea like it held the answers to everything she still carried. When Keanu walked in, he looked different, not disheveled, not dramatic, but more open, as if something invisible had been stripped away from him in the last hour. "Can we go somewhere?" he asked gently. She looked up, caught off guard by the intensity in his voice. "Of course," she said, closing her journal immediately. They drove in silence, his hand occasionally tightening around the steering wheel, hers resting in her lap, fingers slowly tracing the edge of a ring she no longer wore. The car curved along the coastal highway until it stopped at a small lookout point with no signs, no tourists, just a narrow cliff and a wide open sky. The ocean was loud here, louder than it had been by the bench. Waves crashed like truths too long unspoken. He stepped out first and then turned toward her. "There's something I need you to read," he said. She took the letter from his hands with a calm she didn't feel. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she unfolded the page and began to read. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even breathe too loudly. He just let the past speak for itself through the ink of a moment never delivered. As she read, her expression changed, not with shock but with recognition. These were not new confessions. They were the echoes of things she had once felt but never been sure were real. And in those written lines she found proof that she hadn't been alone in her pain, that he had suffered too, that the space between them hadn't been hollow. It had just been unspoken. When she finished, she folded the paper again with reverence and held it in both hands like something sacred. "Why didn't you send it?" she asked softly, not accusing, but aching. "I thought it was too late," he said, "and I was ashamed that it had taken me so long to write it." She looked at him, really looked at him, and her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Do you still believe it's too late?" His answer was immediate and for once, unguarded. "No, not anymore." They stood there for a long time, the wind rushing around them, pulling at their jackets and hair, but neither of them moved. Sandra walked slowly toward him and placed the letter back in his chest pocket. "Then let's stop writing to the past," she said. "Let's start speaking to the future." He reached for her hand, and when she gave it without hesitation, something in the world realigned. Not loudly, not with dramatic flair, but with quiet certainty, the kind that said, "You are finally where you belong." That evening they didn't return to the inn. They stayed out until the stars rose and the tide shifted twice. They spoke like people who no longer feared honesty. Sandra told him about the nights she sat in award shows beside other people, all the while wishing he were the one making her laugh during commercial breaks. Keanu admitted that the reason he never settled down was because everyone else felt like a performance after her. There were no filters anymore, no illusions, no barriers, just two souls, raw and real, finding their way back not through grand gestures, but through small truths finally spoken. And as they walked back along the beach under starlight, Sandra suddenly stopped, turning to him with a half smile. "If you had sent that letter 2 years ago," she asked playfully, "what do you think would have happened?" Keanu looked at her, took a moment to imagine that version of the world, and answered honestly, "I think we would have still ended up here, because this was always meant to happen when we were finally ready." She smiled. Not a performance, not a shield, but the kind of smile that comes from healing, and he knew in that moment they hadn't lost time. They had simply been becoming the people who could finally hold each other the way they were always meant to. The world, still watching. 3 days turned into 4, then 5. Neither of them said they were staying longer. Neither of them discussed what came next, yet neither left. There was something sacred in not naming it, as if speaking too soon would shatter the fragile yet undeniable bond forming again between them. For once, time bent in their favor. They rose late, ate slowly, walked often, and spoke like people who had nothing left to prove but everything left to protect. Their days were filled not with grand gestures, but with stillness. Books passed quietly between them, hands brushing across cafe tables, gazes that held full conversations while the rest of the world continued. Oblivious, but outside that coastal town, the world hadn't forgotten who they were. And it hadn't stopped watching. It happened on the 6th morning, innocent at first. A couple on vacation recognized them as they exited a small bakery. Whispers first, then discreet photos. The next day, a blurry image appeared online. Keanu and Sandra spotted together again, romantic getaway? It was a headline meant to sell clicks, but it carried weight heavier than either of them expected. For years, the press had speculated, obsessed, wondered. They were the pair that never was, the couple who never gave the world a story, only rumors. And now, after all this time, the image of them walking barefoot together along a quiet beach began to unravel the bubble they had built. And reality crept in. Not loudly, but like fog under a closed door. Sandra saw the headline first, sitting on the edge of the bed in her robe, hair still damp from the morning shower. Her heart didn't panic, but it pulsed harder. Not because she was ashamed of him, but because of what it would cost to love him again publicly. She had spent years learning how to protect her peace, and now peace had a face, his. Keanu entered the room moments later, coffee in one hand, her favorite croissant in the other. The way he looked at her hadn't changed, unfiltered, without need to impress, but when she showed him the phone, the quiet in his face shifted. He sat beside her slowly. "They always find a way," he said, no bitterness in his tone, just a quiet resignation. I'm not afraid of them, Sandra said carefully, her eyes locked on the article. I'm just afraid of losing this. Again. Keanu placed the coffee on the nightstand, turned fully to her, and spoke with the clarity of someone who had finally learned what mattered. Then let's not lose it. But let's not hide either, she met his gaze. You think it's that simple? No, he said. But I think love asks us to stop negotiating with fear. That line stayed with her the entire day. Love asks us to stop negotiating with fear. And as they walked along the harbor that evening, with more eyes on them now, more attention, more quiet cameras peeking behind corners, she realized something. Fear wasn't just outside. It had lived inside her, too. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of being vulnerable again. The fear that maybe this time, like last time, the story wouldn't end the way she hoped. But as she looked at Keanu beside her, his calm, his patience, his refusal to perform, she saw something different. He was no longer the man hiding behind mystery. He was choosing to stay present, and that changed everything. Later that night they sat in the lounge of the inn, fire crackling in the stone hearth as the owner brought them tea without asking. You know, she said warmly, I always thought you two had something rare. I've watched people come and go through this place for 20 years. Most just pass through each other. But you two, you orbit. Sandra smiled gently, then asked, And what happens when you orbit too long without landing? The woman shrugged. Eventually, the pull becomes too strong to resist. When the innkeeper left, Sandra leaned into Keanu, resting her head on his shoulder. I'm tired of orbiting, she whispered. He took her hand, held it firm, and answered, Then let's land. The next day, the world tried harder to intrude. Paparazzi parked near the main road. An old colleague sent a message. Is it true? Are you two finally together? A producer called Sandra's agent asking if she'd be available for a reunion film. That night, she stared at her phone as it buzzed with noise that didn't belong to the life she had just started to love again. She placed it down, screen face down, and turned to Keanu. If I asked you to walk away from all this with me, would you? Keanu didn't flinch. I already have, she blinked. What do you mean? I told my team to cancel the next 3 scripts. I needed space. Not just from work. From everything that wasn't real. She swallowed hard. And what is real? He reached over, gently touching the side of her face. This. Her heart broke in the most beautiful way. Not because it was painful, but because it meant letting go of the version of herself that had been surviving alone. She didn't need to protect herself from him anymore. The version of him sitting in front of her wasn't a shadow. He was light, they decided the next morning. They would leave the town together. Not because they wanted to escape, but because they were ready to carry this into the world. Not in headlines, but in reality. Not in interviews or public declarations, but in how they showed up for each other. Every single day. They packed slowly, carefully. He placed the letter she had read back into his bag. Not hidden this time, but resting on top. She folded a photograph of the bench into her wallet. A reminder of the moment they stopped pretending. As they stood outside the inn, bags in hand, the sky suddenly cleared. No rain, no storm. Just quiet light over the water. Sandra looked back one last time, then turned to him. Are we really doing this? Keanu stepped closer. We already are. And with that, they drove off. Not toward a perfect life, not toward certainty, but toward something far rarer. A love that was no longer waiting to be chosen, but already had been. The place where they stayed, it had been almost 2 weeks since they left the small coastal town. The sea no longer roared in their ears, but its rhythm still pulsed through them, like a quiet truth that never needed to be spoken aloud. Life resumed, but it did not return to what it was before. Something in both of them had changed. Not in the explosive, dramatic way the tabloids often described, but in the way that mattered most. They no longer carried the weight of unspoken things. There was no longer the ache of what if between them. Instead, there was presence. Real, imperfect, but grounded presence. Keanu moved slower now, not because of age, but because he had learned the value of lingering. of not rushing past something that deserved to be felt fully. Sandra smiled more, not for the cameras, not for charm, but in those small, quiet ways that came when someone finally felt safe being seen. Together, they were not loud, but they were undeniable. They didn't announce anything. There were no press releases, no interviews, no curated couple photos. But the world noticed anyway. A captured moment at a bookstore. A quiet lunch on a rainy patio. Their hands brushing while crossing a street in New York. The world tried to name it. Rekindled flame. Old stars. New love. Hollywood's silent romance. But no one could write the truth because no one had lived it. Only they knew what it had cost to arrive at this peace. Only they knew how many years had passed in longing, silence, and almosts. Only they knew that love, when returned to after being lost, does not roar like thunder. It settles, like dust over something sacred, like the quiet warmth that rises from an old home after years of absence. One morning, a letter arrived for Sandra. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single folded sheet and the photograph of the bench. On the back of the photo were 5 words in familiar handwriting. You made me come back. Her eyes welled up not from sadness but from recognition. Keanu had sent it, not from a hotel or film set, but from their shared apartment in a quiet part of the city where no one bothered them. A reminder that even now he was still finding ways to say the things he once couldn't. Later that evening, she placed the photo on their bookshelf beside a journal she'd finished filling. Not with stories or dates, but with moments. Today, he stayed up to cook soup when I felt unwell. He kissed my hand. In the grocery store for no reason. He sat beside me in silence while I cried over a movie I've seen 3 times. These were the new love letters. Not sealed in envelopes, but lived, slowly, daily, consistently. The real kind. The kind that never needed cameras or applause. One evening in early spring, they returned. The town hadn't changed much. The bakery still sold the same lemon tarts. The old woman at the inn still remembered their favorite tea. And the bench was still there, weathered now, a little chipped at the corner, but unmoved. Keanu ran his fingers over the wood as they approached it, brushing away the dust like memory itself. Sandra stood behind him for a moment, watching him, watching the sea. Then she said softly, "You know what I realized?" He turned. This bench, it wasn't just where we met. It was where we paused. We paused life. We paused fear. We paused all the noise, he nodded. It was the only place I ever felt time stop. She stepped forward and sat first. Then let's not let it pass unnoticed again. He sat beside her like he had years ago, but this time they didn't sit apart. There was no space left between them. And unlike the first time, when silence was filled with unspoken tension, now it was full of gratitude, of arrival, of love made whole not by perfection, but by honesty. Sandra reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. She handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. She smiled. "A list." He opened the first page and read, "Things we still haven't done together." Beneath it, scribbled in her familiar handwriting, "Ride through Europe on the back of your motorcycle. Watch a sunrise from a mountaintop. Plant a tree together and name it. Adopt an old dog who needs a home. Read a book out loud on rainy Sundays. Have a fight but never sleep angry. Grow old but stay young and wonder. Tell each other, daily, that love is a choice we keep making. Return to the bench, every year, no matter what." Keanu held the notebook to his chest, his eyes too full to speak. When he finally found the words, they came out in a whisper. "Let's do all of it." And she leaned her head on his shoulder again, like she had done in another lifetime, and answered, "We already are." The wind shifted then, not harsh, not loud, but like a deep exhale from the world itself, as if even time had let go of the breath it had been holding for them all these years. And the bench? It remained there, witness to the quiet miracle of love not found, but returned to. Not with fireworks or vows shouted in public, but with stillness. with two people who had once walked away and now, by choice, by truth, by grace, had come back, not to restart, but to finally begin,